Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 67th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, I'd like to revisit something that gives everyone a headache, including myself, and that is the realization that all is mind, all is consciousness. And it's moving away from that vision that there is a separation between the material world and the spiritual world, and all of the divisions that we make are basically artificial. Um, Even though at some level they're not artificial. So it's the same as, for instance, compartmentalizing in your brain your visual cortex with your language processing cortex and all that stuff. And to a certain extent, that is true. That is, there are certain areas of the brain that specialize in certain activities. But at the same time, everything is interlinked. And so while we may be in a construct where there is a distinction between material and immaterial, ultimately, at a higher level, all of those boundaries between those two disappear. So just a quick recap, because this is really important. The theoretical background for what I'm going to say is that just imagine that the only thing that exists is this one point where everything exists at the same time, coexists at the same time. And again, this image where everything exists at the same time and then it disappears and becomes nothing again, because for everything that exists, its opposite exists. And that does a switcheroo infinitely fast. So nothing and everything coexists in the same space. How do you get a universe out of that? Well, again, consciousness, where you have that I am consciousness, which splits into and it tries to observe itself through different angles. And projects on the outside what it thinks it sees. And as I said in the very beginning, the only thing that it sees is vibration. So there's a consciousness that observes this vibration from a certain perspective and then projects itself into that vibration and only focuses on that vibration and creates the illusion that it's isolated from from all other vibrations. And then all these different points of consciousness, which is just the one consciousness, but looking at itself from different vantage points and focusing so hard on that point of view that it creates an ego that wraps around parts of itself that has the illusion that it's separated from the whole. Same here, observes and creates a separate vibration and attaches an ego or a consciousness and wraps around it so that it has the illusion that is disconnected from the whole. And then these interact in a space that doesn't really exist. It is a space which is where it is only in the consciousness of the observer, of that one consciousness that observes itself, its infinite self, which is just that little point, through different perspectives, and creates a world which is virtual. Just like when you close your eyes and you imagine something in your head, then that which you imagine becomes a world where, if you focus hard enough, you create an actual separate consciousness from yourself, like if your thoughts started to have a life of their own, and you don't even have to focus so hard for those to continue to exist. Like they sort of have their own um, um, will to continue to exist. You don't have to focus your attention so hard. They start to have a life of their own. It's like if you've given them an energy and they become autonomous. But ultimately, this interaction, where does it happen? In an illusion kind of space, in a space that doesn't exist. It's only a space that is in the mind. And so ultimately, the only thing that exists is infinity and zero, nothing and everything. That is the reality. And then between those 2 points, then you have the creation of an illusion, which is the only thing that can be experienced, and which our reality is just one tiny little bubble inside a mind, the mind of Source, if you will, the mind of the universal consciousness. And that's the problem, is that we label this as material, like if there's a material world there. And this, all of this, we say that is immaterial. Or spiritual or whatever. But ultimately, that distinction is futile, just like isolating parts of your brain and saying that they're separated or they're different. Ultimately, everything is an illusion, and at the same time, the illusion is the only thing that can be experienced, because this is the reality, but cannot be experienced. No experience. So this is existence. Existence, pure existence, and non-existence, by the way, which is one and the same thing. Non-existence. So non-existence and existence basically are interchangeable, and they're linked to each other for all eternity. And then there is experience, which is something that is in between. So these little vibrations interact, and of course they have sometimes negative, sometimes positive outcomes. For instance, if you have two vibrations that are harmonious, then they consolidate each other and enrich each other. If they're opposite, they might cancel each other out. And then the subjective experience, from the point of view of the ego that is attached to the vibrations, is negative, of course, because they cancel each other out. And then they find, as I've said also, always there's this idea of transcendence, where you find the rules and the strategies for harmonizing the relationships between those different vibrations, which is phi 1.61, and the famous ratio between different vibrations, so that they never interact in a dissonant way. And that's linked to basically just musical notes. So in the beginning there was sound or music, actually. But once you reach that harmony, then the problem of perfect symmetry comes back to bite. And for this, you have a mirror reality where you have, I don't know, minus phi, whatever that is. And so you have to find a strategy for transcending perfect symmetry into a new kind of form where vibrations can coexist in a harmonious way without canceling each other out. And so you create the photon, which, the way I represented it, was vibrations wrapped around each other in a toroidal sort of way. And that's how sort of vibrations escape their own superposition, because they are kind of arranged in a black hole. So the first black hole is the photon, which wraps vibrations around itself and prevents them from superimposing. But, and here's the thing that is really difficult to integrate. This is form. This is the only reality. And so the photon is the form, but what really happens? Well, ultimately what happens is, simply speaking, you have a vibration, and then you add the information that the photon brings about of the interactions between these vibrations, and the strategy that the photon found as information. to this basic vibration. The way I'm going to represent it symbolically is to add a vibration inside vibration. And where this superimposed one represents the information of the photon, or the strategy to escape perfect symmetry. Oh crap, what have I done now? This is so annoying. Anyways, it's just an information added to that vibration. And then what happens when you manifest atoms? Well, you add extra information to that one vibration again, and so on into infinity. And you can zoom in like that into infinity, which means that ultimately what happens is one single simple vibration contains the information of all possible vibrations. So it's as if every single point of view starts to contain essentially all of the information contained in all of the other points of views. But in a unique fashion, because it will only contain information about a specific photon, but still the idea of the photon is going to be contained in every single vibration. And so it's as if it's just like a spermatozoa, basically, or a DNA. They all contain different information, but they all are capable of creating a human being. And so it's as if every single point of consciousness of the universe ultimately is capable of recreating the entire universe by itself, and represents the entire universe by itself, because it contains all of the building blocks, all of the information of all of the building blocks of the universe. It has experienced all building blocks. It has experienced that contains the information about photons, atoms, molecules, human beings, whatever transcends us, spiritual beings, aliens, stars, solar systems, everything. And this is a distinction which is extremely important, is to not confuse the form with the underlying reality. That is, that this is the reality, and then when you translate it when you run it through an interface, specific interface, then you land in a certain sort of illusion or world. And so basically, the human being can be seen as just one of these vibrations, but containing infinite amounts of information on top of this one basic vibration. And then so all of and then it wraps an ego around it, which is our ego, basically the human ego, and then it gives a form to the information it contains, at the thing that we know as our body, for instance. And it also projects a form on the external reality, which is our planet, for instance, and the rocks and nature and everything. And that interface then serves the purpose of defining the rules for how your vibration is going to be affected by the outside, and how you will be able to affect with your vibration the outside. Understand? So, for instance, if you see a ghost, for instance, or another dimension, for instance, the Earth in a million years, where other creatures actually inhabit Earth, some weird aliens or whatever, ultimately, all of that exists at the same time, and the interface is simply like a bubble that filters what can affect your vibration and have an impact on the information of who you are, for instance, which will change your outside illusion, and what can't. And so there's this bubble, for instance, that says, only allow things that are okay with linear time, cause and effect, as in, with the traditional material cause and effect kind of world, with the idea of space, with the idea of linear time, with the idea of plenty of different things. And that is the filter that says that only certain other elements, other consciousnesses that are at a similar kind of stage and contain a similar information, can interact with your vibration and exchange information with it, basically. They can affect who you think you are, and you can affect who they think they are. And play this game of evolution, for instance. For instance, our vibration is not affected by a very young universe which exists at the very same time that we speak right now, that is extremely chaotic, and where these vibrations are still interacting with each other, trying to figure out how to harmonize. And we call that like this residue interference of the Big Bang. Like the little gray, black, and white dots that you see on your TV, like this noise. That doesn't really affect the information that we are. We're not affected by that because we decide that the only effect that it has is that we can sort of have an echo of or an information of what happened back then, during the Big Bang, but not the actual Big Bang as it's happening now, right now. So because we have this idea of linear time, we can only have the echo of it that affects us and penetrates into our vibration and affects the information contained in it. Now, let's go even more crazy and in depth. One single point of consciousness, but then when it projects itself outside, it actually goes through instantaneously all of the holon layers that that exist. So, like I've said in previous videos, because time basically runs infinitely fast, when at one point in the universe, or one point in this observer, when it observes itself, there's always one point where it's going to find instantaneously all of the solutions for transcending itself. Instantly, the vibrations figure out that actually the photon allows them to have this transcendence. And instantly, then the photons know how to arrange themselves to form subparticles like electrons and neutrinos and whatever. And then instantly, the atom knows how to form molecules, and the molecules know how to form the living cell, and the living cell knows how to form, all of these things happen instantly. And so when consciousness observes itself, there's a two-way process. And this is very difficult to understand in a certain perspective, but there is one consciousness that goes from infinity to zero and goes from everything to nothing. And there is one consciousness that goes from zero to infinity and sort of goes from nothing to everything. And the end result of the kind of world that these different consciousnesses then, where they create an ego that wraps around these different elements, and the reality they create on the outside, and the experience they have, is a very savant mix between these two different consciousnesses. Sort of mingle and twist and twirl, and they create two basic forces. One that pulls you towards nothingness, and one that pulls you towards everything. And you could say that this force is the force of chaos or devolution. And this force is the force of order and evolution. But these are not very good terms. It's simply speaking, just to give an example at the human level, it is, for instance, the impulses and basic instincts that drag you towards your animal side, which is going from infinity to zero and is trying to sort of revisit your past in what we call, grounding. And then there's one force which pushes you towards spirituality and growth and evolution as a human being and connecting to your higher selves and all of that. And that is this force for evolution that wants to learn more about itself and looking towards the future and not the past, quote unquote, of course, because this is past and future in a logical sense, not in a time-wise sense. And so there's a balance between the two, and the balance and harmony. How to harmonize these is very basic. Like, for instance, you create paintball fights for revisiting your animal instincts of, this thrill that you experience of, not, well, virtually killing somebody, that is really, exhilarating at some point and really, like, gets you going on certain levels. Or you go to sadomasochist clubs where you can play at certain games with people that are consent to that, like, for instance, rape and all kinds of other things, or submission and pain and whatnot. And then, on the other hand, spirituality and the practice of spirituality in a way that is also in balance and in harmony. And that's like how, for instance, you can reconcile your daily life with, meditation, your guides, and not get lost in, this conspiracy of reptilians controlling the earth and going completely crazy. And there is a balance here to be found, a way to balance these two sort of points of consciousness, one that is dragging you towards nothingness, one that is dragging you towards infinite, pushing you towards infinity. And so that's why, basically, if you didn't have these two forces, if you didn't have those two actions, then this push from zero to infinity would go infinitely fast, which means the universe would experience itself instantly because there would be only one force driving towards evolution and order. And if you didn't have the opposing force dragging you downward, then, how could you it would just be a smooth ride. And basically, the interaction between those two is also what creates free will in a certain respect. So let me see if that's all I wanted to say, basically. Yes, so just a specificity here then. Point of clarification. Everything is mind, everything is consciousness. So I'm saying that there is an interface or an external world that is created here on the outside as an experience for all of these at the same time. And those are, for me, what are dimensions. Like dimensions that coexist and at the same time everywhere. And in the beginning, they're layered one on top of the other. And that's how, like, the universe sort of has to sort these out because they're like compressed. This is like condensed. And that's where you get your stories of dragons and magical creatures coexisting with humans and dinosaurs and aliens, and everything is kind of mingled. And you have these crazy stories where aliens visited us, and yet we are themselves in the past and the future, and everything is kind of bundled and mixed together, and it's a total chaos. Why? Because in the beginning, that's what happens, because the universe doesn't have, there's no point of reference for how to order these. There's no order specifically. There's no logic either. And it's only by them interacting with each other that they can sort themselves out and say, okay, So magical creatures actually they should be in this realm, and humans should be in this realm, which is materialistic, and aliens here, and this that, and then you create bridges between, which are, you create some logical bridges. Like for instance, here you would say that this is in a VR environment that is super immersive and whatever, and that may can make it sort of, the experience of going to see and visit magical creatures can happen from a materialist perspective with that kind of bridge, or it can be via lucid dreams, for instance. Oops. Or any other thing, and then we create other kinds of um, bridges between us and the aliens in their little saucers, and I mean, the bridges that we create is still something that eludes me, because there's so many ways you can build bridges between two interfaces. But ultimately what you have to understand is that there is no separation. All of this, the separations are artificial, simply because otherwise the experience would be just too chaotic. The universe, because it likes to experience itself in the best and the biggest and the most rich way possible, if it didn't create these kind of bubbles that are isolated, then the story would be completely chaotic and make absolutely no sense. So imagine, for instance, if when your baby was born, it thought that it could fly, it had wings, and it could levitate things with its mind, and all kinds of other things from and powers from other dimensions. Imagine the chaos that would ensue in our materialist reality, which is why it's important for these constructs to evolve in a very nice and steady pace. And so ultimately, what's interesting is that all of these dimensions are different interfaces where different forms are given to information that is contained within. And that's really key. It means that our version of the earth, which is like the construct that we live in, is coexisting with the vision of the earth of humanity once it transcends itself somewhere in the future, here, what we call 5D earth. And sorry, it's really not very clear, but so this is our reality construct. And then there is the 5D construct of the earth that exists, is layered right on top of it. But there's also a version of the earth where there's only biology and no humans. And there is also a version of the planet where there are only rocks and seas and nothing alive. And all of these coexist in the same space, and it is the consciousnesses that inhabit Earth that sort of overlay. Like imagine that the Earth is actually a ton of different layers of what it is, like an onion. And each consciousness sort of lives on one onion layer of that earth. See it this way, like for instance, when you have a mother that is pregnant with a baby, the interface that the baby creates once it's still in the womb is basically an illusion. Like it thinks that its mother is only this little restrictive space, and that its mother is basically just a dead thing that gives it resources and allows it to grow. And that's it. It's nothing more. Okay, so there is, and the thing is, and this is really important, is that ultimately that baby is in another dimension. It is not in our dimension. The mother sees the baby from its perspective, its higher dimension. Let's say that the mother looks at the baby from the 5D, but the baby is stuck in 3D, and the only thing that it sees from its mom is the womb. That's the only thing it perceives. And it thinks that the real reality is just the womb. and the rest of the mother doesn't exist from its point of view. And then gradually, as it sort of evolves and goes high, raises its consciousness, then it starts perceiving its mother's voice, for instance, and it starts perceiving the sounds of the outside, and it starts seeing like light penetrate the womb, like when its eyes are starting to be mature. And ultimately what happens is that, and this is really a mind-blowing thing, is that ultimately the process of birth is just the symbolic form that the baby, and both the mother and the baby, sort of give in common accord to the shift in consciousness of the cells of the baby and the baby itself, where the baby, its consciousness is a collective unconscious of its cells, and then once the cells then sort of become aware that they're part of a global collective organism, that this collective unconscious becomes a collective conscious, which is the consciousness of that baby. It's the consciousness that you are living with right now. But that's what gives birth to this awareness, this higher awareness that manifests through the five senses, the interactions with reality. But ultimately, what changes ultimately is that you add another layer of information to the vibration. And then consciousness, the one universal consciousness, once it shines through, once it observes that information and projects it on the outside and gives it a form, then that's what creates the difference between, that's what we call birth. But birth is just a symbolic thing. It's just a symbolic form or a symbolic representation of the shift in consciousness that happens in each cell of that baby. And so it provokes its own birth, if you will, and it also creates its own version of its mother on the outside. That is only a partial image of what the mother is. And so by the same token, we will sort of, by shifting our consciousness, we will go to another layer, another onion layer of what our planet it really is, and only see a tiny fraction create through our perception the 5D version of the planet that we want to see, according to our own personal what makes us unique as a species, as a race, with the experiences we had. And no two humans see their mother in the same way, and no two babies have the same relationship to their mother. And it is the same thing here for us and our relationship to our planet. And to say that 3D is not the natural vibration of Gaia is the same as saying that the womb is not a natural part of the mother. It's just silly. It's not. There's no natural vibration for a planet. It's just that the planet exists at the same time as all of these layers. It exists as just a rock with some oceans here. It exists as a planet with just basic creatures, like basic biology, and with higher consciousnesses like us, and all of those coexist at the same time. And then, of course, there are interactions between these, which also help in this evolution. And that's why it's so complicated, so complicated to really understand this, because the exchanges of information happen in between these different dimensions like this, but also between past and future like this, And as I said, everything is linked to everything else, everything is tied to everything else. And so, this causal relationship that we have built for ourselves with cause and effect and all that is just such a leap from the complexity of the interactions between all the different um, parts in the universe and how it actually works. And the reason I'm saying it's much easier to see it as a mind or a brain is that imagine if in these different dimensions, I'll call them dimensions, only a few parts of these are actually activated. That is, these experiences are only certain number of experiences are happening in the now, and those experiences are sort of linked to each other in a certain way, just like neurons in your brain. And then in the next moment of the now, maybe certain experiences have come to an end, and other experiences are now happening in the now, and now there are new bridges that are built between those. And it's just like the making of new connections in your brain, and new neural connections that are made, and some new connections are made, some other die. And this whole process serves just one purpose, is just the the evolution of the cosmic mind of that one single consciousness, which, by sharing its attributes with the different neurons that are alive and that think that they're autonomous um, in those different dimensions, allow this mind to experience more of what it is, what it exists, what is possible to experience. Um, and that is, it's more interesting to make a distinction between the manifest and the non-manifest, or what is experienced and what is not experienced yet, um, than between material and immaterial. Because ultimately, like I said, the real reality is that everything is vibrations, and then the only difference is the interface. And yes, you can build an interface which we would call materialistic, but it's only like saying, like giving a specific name to Windows, saying that is a material operating system, as opposed to Mac OS, which is an etheric operating system. And doesn't make sense. I don't know. It's, of course, it's useful to isolate us within a certain experience, and making sure that, like I said here, you have certain rules for the information that allows to penetrate and influence and exchange with you. Just like the neural connections between certain neurons correspond to certain rules. But other than that, the distinction between material and immaterial is not all that interesting. And so finally, there's this distinction between what is life, what is alive, what is not alive. I mean, you know, it's just, the only thing that matters is that when consciousness sort of um, shines through a certain form, it can simply create a certain experience on the outside. And that certain experience is just more or less rich. And actually, everything is alive, quote unquote. I think what we make the distinction of what is alive and what is not alive is what has free will and what doesn't. Because ultimately, imagine if an atom was not responding to any kind of formula, but there was some element of unpredictability, which would make it look like it had a will of its own. And that actually may very well exist, but in this dimension only, where atoms have not yet sort of um, um, you know submitted itself to the rules of chemistry and biology, and therefore sort of delegated their free will to a higher power entirely, to enjoy an experience which is much more rich than bumping into each other. So we will never actually see atoms acting as if they were alive, because if they were, we would die instantly, because we would disintegrate and then reintegrate, you know. And so basically, consciousness then shines through all of the constitutive elements that we are. So they shine through the vibration, the photon, the atom, the living cell, then the human, and then it creates this interface, this dimension. And so ultimately, everything is alive. Even light is alive. Even sound is alive. Everything is alive, but it's just that its free will, it accepts to surrender its free will just to have a richer experience within something bigger than itself. And that's the same that we are experiencing right now. Ultimately, there is a universe, like, for instance, there's a reality 10 million years from now where humans have completely kind of surrendered their free will, but not to a tyrannic AI, but almost like really surrendering completely to your higher self. And that's what allows us to have an experience which is absolutely mind blowing. Imagine, for instance, if every single person on this planet had the same superpowers as Superman. If we didn't surrender our free will to some higher power, some higher instinct, or some higher intuition or guides or whatever, how quickly do you think that this experience would turn into chaos? And we would start fighting each other and we would destroy the entire universe with 7 billion Supermans. And that is exactly what happens when, if you transition to another higher dimension as these parts, but if you refuse to conform to or surrender your free will, which makes you which gives the illusion that you're no longer alive because you don't have a free will. Well, like I said, if the atoms were quote unquote alive and had free will, we would disintegrate. By the same token, if we were Superman but we had still 100% free will, then the global sort of consciousness that represents us, where we are each a cell in that consciousness, was also disintegrate instantly. Um, so I know this was really a mind bending episode, but I think it's really important to clarify things and not get too hung up on the interface, understanding the logic, understanding that ultimately alive versus non-alive is maybe more linked to certain ideas like this free will. And of course, the more free will, like we think that alive stops at the living cell because that is the last sort of element in our observable interface, which is here, that displays a certain amount of free will that we would deem is a necessary precondition for labeling it as alive. But it's an absurd distinction. Now, of course, it's not about completely getting rid of all dualities, but simply creating these bridges between different consciousness bubbles without completely fusing and merging with them either. Creating neural connections which completely liberates us instead of isolating ourselves like a neuron that would isolate itself in the brain and not make any connections with other neurons. And so I hope that was interesting. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And I want to thank John in particular for asking really interesting questions which trigger some new thoughts in my mind, and the impetus for creating new videos and new content. So thanks very much, and talk to you in the next video.